Thank you, Senator Feingold. And just to chime in on that point, I think it's clear that I also agree that the time will come when it frankly becomes inevitable that a nonpartisan authoritative commission should take a look at the work of Senator Feinstein's investigations, the OPR opinions, what the Judiciary Committee does under the leadership of Chairman Leahy, and other factors, and draw it all together so that the American people can make the appropriate conclusions. Now, our first witness is David Luban. Professor Luban is a leading expert on legal ethics. He has written numerous articles and books on the subject, including Legal Ethics, a leading textbook on the subject, and Legal Ethics and Human Dignity, which collects selected essays he's written on legal ethics during the last 20 years. He is the University Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center, where he has taught since he joined the faculty of Georgetown University Law Center in 1997. He has previously taught at the University of Maryland, Yale, and Kent State universities. He holds a PhD from Yale University and a BA from the University of Chicago. Professor Luban's recent research interests have included the legal ethics implication of U.S. torture policy and the powers granted to the President by the Constitution. As a result, he's particularly well suited to evaluate the OLC memos and explain the ethical issues that they raise. Professor Luban.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Senator Graham, Chairman Leahy, and distinguished members of the committee.
Professor Luban, let me say one thing quickly because you're our first witness. I'd like to try to keep all of the witness statements here, some of them are quite lengthy on paper, to 5 minutes. And so at some point, witnesses are going to start hearing this noise, which is your warning that the 5 minutes has run out, and if you could please wrap it up. And if you extend too far beyond it, I'll simply cut you off so that everybody has a fair chance and so that the senators have a chance to engage in dialogue, which is the most helpful part of a hearing.
I may go a minute or so over. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. You've asked me to talk about the legal ethics of the torture and interrogation memos written by lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel. Based on the publicly available sources I've studied, I believe that the memos are an ethical train wreck. When a lawyer advises a client about what the law requires, there is one basic ethical obligation: to tell it straight, without slanting or skewing. That can be a hard thing to do if the legal answer isn't the one the client wants. Very few lawyers ever enjoy saying no to a client who is hoping for yes. But the profession's ethical standard is clear. A legal advisor must use independent judgment and give candid, unvarnished advice. In the words of the American Bar Association, a lawyer should not be deterred from giving candid advice by the prospect that the advice will be unpalatable to the client. That is the governing standard for all lawyers, in public practice or private, but it's doubly important for lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel. The mission of the OLC is to give the President advice to guide him in fulfilling an awesome constitutional obligation, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Faithful execution means interpreting the law without stretching it and without looking for loopholes. OLC's job is not to rubber stamp administration policies, and it is not to provide legal cover for illegal actions. No lawyer's advice should do that. The rules of professional ethics forbid lawyers from counseling or assisting clients in illegal conduct. They require competence, and they demand that lawyers explain enough that the client can make an informed decision, which surely means explaining the law as it is. These are standards that the entire legal profession recognizes. Unfortunately, the torture memos fall far short of professional standards of candid advice and independent judgment. They involve a selective and in places deeply eccentric reading of the law. The memos cherry-pick sources of law that back their conclusions and leave out sources of law that do not. They read as if they were reverse-engineered to reach a predetermined outcome: approval of waterboarding and the other CIA techniques. Now, my written statement goes through the memos in detail, Mr. Chairman. Let me give just one example here of what I'm talking about. 26 years ago, President Reagan's Justice Department prosecuted law enforcement officers for waterboarding prisoners to make them confess. The case is called United States versus Lee. 4 men were convicted and drew hefty sentences that the Court of Appeals upheld. The Court of Appeals repeatedly referred to the technique of waterboarding as torture. This is perhaps the single most relevant case in American law on the legality of waterboarding. Any lawyer can find the Lee case in a few seconds on a computer just by typing the words water torture into a database. But the authors of the torture memos never mentioned it. They had no trouble finding a case where lawyers didn't call harsh interrogation techniques torture. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that Mr. Yu, Judge Bybee, and Mr. Bradbury chose not to mention the Lee case because it casts doubt on their conclusion that waterboarding is legal. Without getting further into technicalities that, quite frankly, only a lawyer could love, maybe not even a lawyer, only a professor could love, I'd like to mention briefly other ways that the torture memos twisted and distorted the law. The first Bybee memo advances a startlingly broad theory of executive power according to which the president, as commander-in-chief, can override criminal laws. This was a theory that Jack Goldsmith, who headed the OLC after Judge Bybee's departure, described as an extreme conclusion that, quote, has no foundation in prior OLC opinions or in judicial decisions or in any other source of law. Quote, close quote. It comes very close to President Nixon's notorious statement that when the president does it, that means it is not illegal, except that Mr. Nixon was speaking off the cuff in a high-pressure interview, not a written opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel. The first Bybee memo also wrenches language from a Medicare statute to explain the legal definition of torture. The Medicare statute lists severe pain as a symptom that might indicate a medical emergency. Mr. Yu flips the statute and announces that only pain equivalent in intensity to organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death can be severe. This definition was so bizarre that the OLC itself disowned it a few months after it became public. It is unusual for one OLC opinion to disown an earlier one, and it shows just how far out of the mainstream Professor Yu and Judge Bybee had wandered. The memo's authors were obviously looking for a standard of torture so high that none of the enhanced interrogation techniques would count. But legal ethics does not permit lawyers to make frivolous arguments merely because it gets them the results they wanted. I should note that on January 15th of this year, Mr. Bradbury found it necessary to withdraw 6 additional OLC opinions by Professor Yu or Judge Bybee. Mr. Chairman, recent news reports have said that the Justice Department's internal ethics watchdog, the Office of Professional Responsibility, has completed a 5-year investigation of the torture memos. OPR has the power to refer lawyers to their state bar disciplinary authorities, and news reports say they will do so. I have no personal knowledge about what OPR has found. Presumably, investigators were looking either for evidence of incompetence, evidence that the lawyers knew their memos don't accurately reflect the law, or evidence that the process was short-circuited. This morning, I have called the torture memos a legal train wreck. I believe it's impossible that lawyers of such great talent and intelligence could have written these memos in the good faith belief that they accurately state the law. But what I or anyone else believes is irrelevant. Ethics violations must be proved by clear and convincing evidence and not just asserted. That sets a high bar, and it should be a high bar. In closing, I would like to emphasize to this committee that when OLC lawyers write opinions, especially secret opinions, the stakes are high. Their advice governs the executive branch, and officials must be told frankly when they are on legal thin ice or crossing over into unlawful conduct. They and the American people deserve the highest level of professionalism and independent, let me emphasize independent judgment, and I am sorry to say that they did not get it here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Luban. One of the perils of Senate hearings is votes that happen. And a vote has just happened.
Oh, my God.
And what I will do is recess the hearing for 5 minutes to give us a chance to vote. People usually take longer than that, but I will be back immediately to call the hearing back into session. And if other people need to take a little bit more time, it'll be underway, and we're glad to have you come back. But for now, the hearing is temporarily adjourned so that we can vote.